welcome everybody to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. Today we're joined by Fatimah Gilliam, author of Race Rules, What Your Black Friend Won't Tell You. Moving beyond theoretical discussions, Fatimah's work provides a practical framework for disrupting racism in everyday life. She draws from her unique experiences spanning Wall Street, the United Nations, and corporate consulting, and she offers just amazingly concrete tools for transforming how we approach cross-racial interactions. She has a 3-step process that challenges readers to move from passive learning to active disruption, making this conversation essential for anyone committing to creating meaningful change in their personal and professional lives. So, without further ado, Fatimah, thank you so much for joining our podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Danielle. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, it's honestly quite a pleasure. I mean, I was looking through your materials and, you say some things that I think a lot of people out there need to hear these days, in the current climate that we're working with. And our listeners today are also people who have inspired change in their own industries. So I think that what we're going to talk about today is going to make a huge impact on everybody listening. So thank you so much again. I'd like to start off with just a little bit of a question based on your background and your history. So, as I mentioned before, your path went from Wall Street to the UN, with the World Food Program, to funding the Azara Group. So I'm just wondering, what inspired these transitions and how did you go from that to where you are today?
Well, when I was growing up, I was always somebody who didn't think that I was going to follow a linear, traditional kind of path. I've always been somewhat of a self-starter and had different interests, even in thinking about where I decided to go to school. So just telling the people here today a little more about me. So I grew up in California, third generation Californian. My family's been in the United States for nearly 400 years. And I live on the East Coast now. So I went to Wellesley College for my undergraduate. Then from there, I went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard to get my master in public policy because I was always interested in these bigger picture issues impacting society. And then from there, moved to New York to go to Columbia Law School. So started my career as a corporate attorney, as you mentioned, working for Cleary Gottlieb. Then from there, I went to Citigroup, overseeing all of Citi's diversity recruiting for all of its U.S. businesses, for its campus roles, and then went to the United Nations, where I was the head of finance and fundraising for North America for the World Food Program. And most people haven't heard of the World Food Program because they spend $0 on marketing. But they are the world's largest humanitarian relief organization fighting hunger. So if there's a famine, people that are experiencing food insecurity in developing countries, there's a war breaking out, they are the lead logistics organization for coordinating the humanitarian community and then also for getting people food. And so I was overseeing corporate partnerships. And then after being there for a couple of years, decided to start my own consulting business focused on, effectively I help people and organizations get what they want. So that could be around a diversity issue, a leadership issue. And I spent a lot of time dealing with conflict resolution and negotiating. So that was just to give people some background, but to answer your question of me not following this traditional path, my career has always been about me moving closer and closer to my core beliefs. So when I was working at the law firm, it was great training, but that didn't necessarily align with how I wanted to make a broader impact on society. I got closer to that when I moved to Citigroup because I was impacting organizations and creating opportunities for diverse people, but that still didn't get me far enough. And then I wanted to scratch my public sector itch and then went to the UN. What I'm doing now enables me to leverage all of my skills to help people and organizations for whatever challenge they're facing. And when I was practicing law or working in a corporation, I felt that, that drove on one specific core set of skills or focus on achieving objectives in a very straightforward, myopic kind of way. But now I get to draw on all of these skills together, all of my interests together, while also being a person who cares deeply about things like politics and society. So I know that was long-winded, but I wanted to give people some context about my background too.
Yeah, no, I always love to start a podcast with a little bit of background about who we're talking to, because otherwise, how are you going to put everything into context, right? But, one thing that you said that was just very moving and meaningful is that every step on your path is moving you closer to your core beliefs. I think there's something, really powerful in that, because you're holding this belief strong enough that you're not letting anything else really get in your way of it. And two is almost a luxury of being able to make those kind of choices and know kind of guide your life in that path too. A lot of people might feel like closed off, like they're working in a corporate job, and even if they have a belief they want to make a change, maybe they don't have the initiative or the resources to do so. I think that's just incredible that you've done that. I mean, would you agree that maybe not everybody is able to sort of make those changes, or perhaps maybe your book also offers us ways to do that?
Well, I do think my book does offer people some pathways to doing that. I think people really struggle within organizations, and sometimes they're dealing with an internal conflict about what the organization is trying to do and what they personally think is right or wrong. And that also leads to, I think, a lot of people feeling miserable or not feeling that they're making the type of impact that they need to make, and frankly, some people are just doing things that just go against their moral code.
And I'm sure that that not only like leaves them staying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about it, but also just it leads you to like not being fulfilled and satisfied in your life, what you're doing in your daily routine. Not to mention like the broader impact of it all too, like personally and outside of your own bubble too. That must be really challenging. And I can only, I guess you could say that your book definitely helps to break those barriers. I mean, I skimmed through a little bit and read through a bunch of, the beginning sections here. And one thing I noticed is you kind of talk a lot about the bedrock race rule. It's kind of like a three-step process,
Mm-hmm.
talking about how thoughts without deeds don't lead to adequate progress. So I guess that kind of goes to what we're talking about because, if you're in that job that maybe you're not doing things you believe in, thinking about it doesn't necessarily change things, right? Is that sort of
Well,
what the bedrock process would be?
for part of it, I mean, I think first and foremost, people have to decide what do they stand for. And I was talking about the conflict that people may have to deal with. They have to decide, like, who are they and what are they willing to do or change within an organization or within their own lives to align their intention with their impact or align with how they perceive themselves to how they actually are. And so what I do in Race Rules, which is a how-to guide on how to make less offensive choices and decisions, how people can connect across differences. And when I say that, I also mean specifically with race, although people can apply, frankly, my bedrock race rule to gender or religion or a whole bunch of other things. But, I recognize that people are lazy readers. I mean, that's just a reality, right? And people don't want to do the hard work, and not everybody wakes up and says, oh, today's the day I'm going to take myself on as a project, right? Like they don't necessarily do
Yeah.
that. And when it comes to really difficult, uncomfortable topics like race and diversity that many people are allergic to or shy away from, I decided I wanted to present information and advice to people in an easily digestible format where people can hop around in real time and find the topic that's relevant for them in a sort of choose your own race knowledge adventure where, race rule number 15, if you need to read about tokenization, you don't necessarily have to have read everything before that to sort of get some quick context and make a better decision. So I've got rules that talk about colorblindness, taking a knee, voting rights, cultural appropriation, how to apologize, discussion on race, all of these very topic specific ways and issues that people may grapple with. And then I also created the universal rule, the bedrock race rule, to help people make decisions on topics that I didn't present a specific pathway for so that they can come to their own decision making, right? And it has 3 steps. The first thing is, people have to choose to disrupt racism every single day if they want to have an impact. And I provide steps to that. So step 1 is learn to unlearn. They have to engage in some external education. Step 2 is reflect to repair. They need to engage in an internal evaluation of the choices and decisions and behaviors that they've engaged in the past and how that's had positive or negative impact on other people. And then step 3, they have to act to address. They have to engage in positive action. So they can't just be thinking, oh, that's terrible, or I think that's bad. They have to actually do something about it. And if people aren't doing anything about it, then frankly, they're not helpful.
Understood. Yeah, all of that's very powerful stuff. And I'm sure that you get just a lot of feedback and a lot of people saying, you've helped me make my life better. You've changed everything because of these ways that you're debunking the common ways that we go about things. There's a lot to unpack there. And before we go into that, though, I just kind of want to make a comment on how you said it, you made it accessible to your readers, you know, like, 'cause readers are lazy. And, you know, since we're talking about books and everything here on our podcast, I think it's important just to note before we go into the specifics that that's how you're able to get to your reader, because you made it so easy for them to flip to any passage, any chapter. They don't have to read the other chapters. They can go to the content they need. Not only that, but that last section you told me about where, you know, the bedrock chapters, they can make their own decisions. You made it evergreen in that way because, you know, certain topics might not always be relevant, but by giving them the strategies so that they can make their own decisions later down the road, your theories are always going to be relevant, evergreen, right? It's not going to be out of date. So I think that's an amazing way that you presented your information, something that all of our listeners can learn from too.
And I'll also say, you know, this other part too, Danielle, is that every rule has an illustration. And that's because research shows that people retain more information when there's a visual cue than when they're just reading something. And so I wanted to take each chapter. I didn't do the drawing though, but I would say each illustration, there are 31 illustrations, probably took no less than 10 hours of my time, you know, brainstorming and thinking about how to visually represent some core messages in the chapter. And then I also have like translation charts. You said this, we heard this, why don't you say this instead? You know, or for my voting rights chapter, I have like Jim Crow versus Jim Crow 2.0 and showing the similarities across time. Or, you know, impact versus intent chart showing like you might have intended this, but this is what actually happened. Why don't you consider doing this instead? You know, it's just trying to make the information more understandable for people. And it's also the quiet part out loud, right? So it's an unvarnished truth, not being diplomatic, and that's very intentional with my strategy.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have those intentional strategies from day one that you start writing your book. You know, when you plan it out, you need to make sure that you have ways like that. And illustrations and graphics, that's pretty genius. I think it's something that maybe our listeners haven't considered yet. If they're writing their books about their business strategies or their, you know, path to where they are today. Guys, if you're listening to this, consider a diagram, right? Consider a picture, an image, just like Fatima just told us, because at the end of the day, your readers are probably going to remember that doodle or that chart more than the, you know, framing of the paragraph. So it's a good way to keep it fresh in readers' minds and also break down the content because, you know, again, your content is extremely important, things that we do need to remember. You can't risk them just passing it by. They need to remember it. So I love that you did that. Was it something you came up with on your own, or did you work with perhaps like a team of people who helped you build that or give that strategy?
I mean, I had the concept for the book and knew out the gates that I wanted to have illustrations in my book. The story behind, like when I had this aha moment to write the book, you know, I was watching the news one day and it was another story of a Karen going viral for calling the police for no reason. You know, okay. And frankly, these happen every single week, sadly. But as I watched this news story unfold, I started to think about several different things. I thought about the rinse and repeat questions that friends, colleagues, and clients have asked me. I thought about the repetitive blunders that I see happening over and over again. I thought about some of the consulting work that I've done in the diversity space and the challenges that I see within organizations and the struggles that people have, not just in terms of not knowing what to do, but also like information gaps. And I thought about the things that white people say around me when they don't realize I'm Black. And as that happened, I had this like light bulb moment. I was like, oh, okay. White people need a manual. They need a manual. So I started writing that book and wanting it to be very different from other books that are out there. So if you think about the books that are already out there talking about race, they fall into a couple of buckets. It's either this sort of like academic, feels like a treatise potentially, book that talks about history and systems and structures and how racism shows up in society and why things are the way that they are. Or it's sort of like an autobiographical book, or it's written by a journalist. It could be written by still an academic or somebody, or even a celebrity that like inserts themselves into the story. And the book is very much about their experiences and then how we can learn about racism or discrimination or prejudice through their personal experiences. And that's great. All of those are great to understand how racism manifests. And then what? What happens after that? There really is not and was not a book that gives people like concrete advice. like some do's and don'ts. And it's just some blunt, honest, frank talk in a way where people can just, frankly get some quick advice on what they should do. And I also will say that it's important to think about the book like beyond the context of thinking, oh, well, this is just a book about race, and I should only be thinking about this when I'm trying to think about race in America, or race or diversity within the workplace, or interacting in a different way with somebody in my family. Yes, it's helpful for people's professional lives and their personal lives, but this is also a book about negotiating. It's also about building trust or strengthening relationships, or how to avoid deal breaker choices and relationship killer behaviors. I say this frequently, but like if somebody were to go to Japan and they wanted to negotiate a business transaction or develop a business relationship, they wouldn't think twice about the fact that to be successful in that meeting and on that trip, it might be helpful if they know something about Japanese history and culture, right? About what might offend Japanese people. What are some norms? What are some taboos when you go there or when you're conducting business there? They wouldn't think twice about that. But they never think about it within the context of their own country, the United States, in terms of like, how can you positively interact with a colleague, with a client, with a key stakeholder, with a board member, with a customer, with someone on your team? They don't think about that. And by not doing that, they put themselves in a negative position with the diverse people, the people of color, or or say women on their team, or that they interact with. I think very frequently about, someone that, I know that worked at a major law firm. And when she was a senior associate at the firm, she worked very closely with this white partner who frankly, didn't treat her well. He said a lot of offensive things to her. He engaged in some offensive behavior. She didn't feel like he was invested in her professional development and training her appropriately to rise up to the ranks to become a partner. So she eventually, left the firm, and she went in-house to be counsel at a major corporation that was a client of the firm. And once she was inside that company, then it was like she couldn't bat away that partner fast enough. I mean, he was, reaching out to her, wanted to meet with her, wanted to court her because he wanted to get more business. But she didn't forget how he treated her. She didn't forget all those microaggressions. So what did she do? She didn't just not want to meet with him. She killed all the business to that firm and moved it to another law firm.
She should.
Because he didn't know how to treat her right.
Yeah. Wow. So I love the way that, your book not only fills a need, like, for example, I mean, sometimes you're right, people need a how-to guide. They're wondering, okay, am what I'm saying is right? Was it not said right? Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I'm not overthinking it. Maybe it has to be analyzed. Maybe it shouldn't be. This kind of stuff needs to be talked about, and it's something that other people are comfortable with doing. But also drawing upon that example, I mean, a perfect example, right? You don't know the impact you're making on somebody sometimes, or maybe you do, but like, how do you handle that? What do you do? And I think that's amazing that you were able to put it into kind of a step-by-step guide. And I'm glad that we're getting more into the topic of your book, because we know you did a great job of like keeping it simple, putting illustrations, but now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So I'm kind of wondering, like, perhaps you could share it with our listeners, maybe like one of the tips. I know there's like a bunch in there, but maybe one snippet that might be relevant to our listeners to hear today that they can apply tomorrow when they go to the office, or whenever it is that they go into the office next.
Well, I mean, I think something that's really important, that I really want people to internalize is that it is important to take action, right? That if they're not being proactive, if they're not speaking up, then they're not being helpful. There was this interesting study that Deloitte came out with in 2019 about allyship. And they surveyed people and asked them, do they consider themselves to be allies? And something like 92% of people said that they consider themselves to be an ally. But less than 30% of people said that when they saw something terrible happen, they did anything about it. So that's a mismatch between how people see themselves and how they're actually behaving. Mm. And so, I think one of the more important things is that to be helpful, right? To be a good global citizen, to be a good colleague to the people of color where you work, is that you have to speak up. you have to take action. And when you speak up and take action, you have to think about what I'm doing. Is it going to positively impact people and move away just from your intention of something, and really think about whether or not you're going to be aligning like what you hope to achieve and what you actually achieve.
Understood. Yeah, yeah, because you can't just sit back and pretend that something's not happening. I mean, same way if you were to see like a little kid picking on another little kid. I mean, not bad example maybe, but like, they always say like there's the bystanders, right? Where there's people who actually take action to do something. So, I think that's important for us to realize too, because it applies in an everyday context as well. So, yeah, I mean, to all of our listeners right now, now that you've heard that, maybe we can give them a homework assignment. Maybe they can go tomorrow and think of a way that they can try to implement that in their own lives. I mean, I'm assuming your book also comes with sort of action steps like that too. Like, all right, now that you read this tip, yeah. So in your book, what exactly would be like that next step to
Well, it depends on like what the topic is, but I will say like the last chapter of the book, I give people some tips as to what they could be doing, on an individual level, what they could be doing on a personal level, what they could be doing on a community level. So sometimes it is one thing that people can do and that they can commit to in terms of educating themselves is they can be at a monthly basis or a bi-weekly basis. They can watch a documentary to learn something. They could volunteer somewhere that puts themselves in environments where they interact with people that don't look like them, so that they can get better. I mean, the thing that's really important for people to understand is they're going to make mistakes, right? Like they're going to offend people. It's not going to be a perfect process. It might get rocky, but when they offend people, that they shouldn't just retreat and say, okay, I tried that, I failed, I'm just going to hide under a rock. Instead, they should analyze like, okay, well, what didn't go well in that context? And how could I do things differently? And what did I learn in that moment that will enable me to do better the next time? So becoming a racism disruptor, becoming somebody that's proactive, it's like driving a car. Like first you had to go to driver's ed, then you did some driver's training,
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
And then once you actually have your license, you're still making mistakes. You get into some accidents, some fender benders here and there. Technology changes. You got to learn something new. You have to always be looking down the road to sort of predict what could be coming down the pike and evolving and changing. And so it's the same in terms of thinking about living in this very diverse society. We're going to be learning things over and over again and adapting and changing. Like, back in the day, you could call somebody a Negro. You can't call them a Negro anymore. You know what I mean? Right?
And so you always have to stay up to date and know what's going on.
Yeah. You have to adjust with the times, and it's important for people to think about that and recognize that they own their own journey, right? Like, I've taken it upon myself to write this book to educate people. But, a lot of times when white people want to learn something about people who don't look like them, they just run to some person of color that they know, which is tokenizing them. And, and is like, oh, can you teach me about this? Or I would like to learn about this, without doing any sort of basic self-education. And at the end of the day, you have to educate yourself. You are responsible for yourself. You can't turn to a person of color and put the onus and the emotional energy and responsibility on them to educate you. And, just as we've grown into functioning adults who know things about history and society and grammar and all of these other things, sometimes I ask myself, because I'm going to be blunt, I also just think a whole bunch of people are lazy. I have to say, why did you enable yourself to get to this point in adulthood without knowing these things? And now that you recognize you don't know these things, why are you still allowing yourself to remain ignorant?
Yeah, I get there's a difference between having the blinders on, right? Or having that blinders removed, but then still just choosing to look straight ahead, right? Kind of comparing it to a horse or something, you know what I mean?
No, it's true. I talk a lot about wearing blinders in the book.
Oh, okay, yeah. So you know exactly what I mean. I understand that. So I mean, I'll personally admit, like I do recognize I might not know everything there is to know that I could potentially be improving on. So I mean, I'm probably gonna pick up your book now too, because I would hate for anybody to be like to take something I say the wrong way or something I do the wrong way. So I think this is important for anybody listening right now to also pick it up because you don't know what you don't know, and if you recognize that you don't know, fix it.
Exactly. I mean,
So
one of the things that I also talk about, Danielle, in the book is, I want people to move away from exceptionalism, right? Like when I was writing this book and even with this book out, people will say, like, I know of somebody who this book will be great for. And I'm thinking, yeah, you.
yeah, why not
This
yourself?
book would be great for you. Yes, gift it to someone that you think would be helpful. And the book is, helpful for other people of color, and also for Black people too. The you in my writing is a white person, but this, a lot of times people think what racism is like the person who shows up to the supermarket with an AR-15 and shoots every person of color that they can see. And therefore, it enables them to say, like, racism is that stuff that's like all the way over there. And they don't think about it in terms of like, what are they personally doing? What are they doing when they don't say anything, which makes them complicit, right? That creates an environment for the status quo that supports opportunity hoarding or encourages racial discrimination. Or when they go to the poll and they vote for something, they say, oh, I think it's important that we have things like access to education, but then they don't want to change the tax code where school funding is linked to property taxes, which then enables like all the wealthy communities to have all of the tax money for better schools and the poorer communities to not, right? And they don't think about that is actually supporting a white supremacist caste system in the United States.
I mean, I did not think about it in that much depth. I'm actually kind of impressed and surprised that your book doesn't just cover over tips, like generic, like what are we going to do in the office, but you're going beyond that now too. I mean, this is stuff like from the very core of what we're doing, like children and where they go to school and the principles that drive them. That's a whole nother level. That must have taken a lot of research on your part.
It did take a lot of research, and there are chapters that have history and then ones that don't, right? So like I invented this term called white welfare. And I say it is the ultimate entitlement program for white people, enabling them to have white-centered opportunity hoarding, a sense of entitlement to limitless winning, and it's a transference of wealth, that's backed by not just societal norms, but policies and laws. And in that chapter, which is race rule number 7, I break down American history, like going from indigenous genocide and African enslavement and bringing it to the present, right? So people think, well, I didn't own slaves, I'm not the one that took all the land from the Native Americans. Like, what do I have to do about that, right? But if we have these policies that go through the present that have supported a wealth gap, people have to think about like, what is their participation in that, right? So we had genocide, right? And like enslavement and indigenous genocide. And then after that, we had the Homestead Act that gave away a whole bunch of free land, right? So if people think about that film, I know it's somewhat of an old film, like Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, and they're like in their chuck wagons staking a claim for land. What was that? That was the Homestead Act. That's where the government gave away a whole bunch of land for free, right? But who got that land? You didn't really get that land if you're Black, and you really didn't get that land if you're indigenous, or if you're here, the Chinese building the railroads, you didn't get that land, right? So we gave away land, and then we created like land grant colleges that taught people how to mechanize their farm and gave them loans and access to, machinery. But those universities, like these public universities, only one kind of person can go there, right? And then from there, you could bring it to the New Deal. Through the New Deal, that's when the government created 30-year fixed mortgage after the credit crisis, which then bailed out all those people that got free land so that they can get fixed mortgages, that then gave most of those mortgages only to white people. And then from there, you have the GI Bill, where then we're giving away, access to capital to start businesses and to go to school. But again, Mostly white people were able to access that, even though you had Blacks and Latinos that were in the military, even though you had Black people who could afford to get these 30-year fixed mortgages, but weren't able to get them. Something like 98% of mortgages between 1934 and 1968, maybe, only went to white people. And it wasn't because they could only afford it. It was because we created redlining and the suburbanization and the ghettoization of America along racial lines. So when somebody says, well, I didn't own slaves, okay. But 1 out of 4 Americans in the year 2000 can trace their land back to the Homestead Act, right? Then you have people that have gotten access to capital, which enables them to send their kids to school, to pay for retirement, to take care of old people, and to have a more comfortable life. That creates a racial wealth gap. Yeah, you didn't own slaves, but you sure as hell follow the yellow brick road to opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, so this is all stuff that I think a lot of our listeners, I mean, if they're anything like me, that we've heard about these historical, things that have happened, but you've been taking it and kind of putting a magnifying glass on it, right? Or like shining that huge skylight onto it, because I think like a lot of us, know about it, we don't know the implications it really had until we think about it that way. And I think if this doesn't wake up our listeners or wake up the readers of your book, then I don't know what's going to, because, if you're thinking we've done this for so many years, then why is it still happening, right?
Well,
So,
I think it's still happening because people are racist. To be blunt about it, and we're in a time frame right now where there's a retrenchment, right? Like you have this attack on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. You have a rolling back of affirmative action. I think it's really important for people to understand the history so that they could be more supportive of programs. Like, for example, I have a chapter on colorblindness. People love to quote Martin Luther King and talk about this like fictional mountaintop that we weren't even at. We're talking about judging people by their content of their character versus the color of their skin. That was aspirational, right? But people use that as a tool to support race neutral colorblindness ideologies. And I say colorblindness is actually supporting racism. And instead, Martin Luther King was for affirmative action. So I'm going to paraphrase. He said, a country that has done something specific to the Negro must do something specific for the Negro. And so given a quick little dial down on American history, so if that's what brought us to today, what are we going to do about it? We can't solve it if we can't actually have policies and initiatives that do take race into consideration, right? So people want to say, oh, reverse discrimination, which I don't believe is the thing. And they're going to say, well, universities want to take into consideration race for admissions. And I think that's discriminating against white people. No, you have to have a solution to deal with the structural issues and the racism that has taken place over time, instead of weaponizing the solution to maintain the status quo that supports white supremacy. Because otherwise you can never solve anything. If you have to have a policy that's for everybody, then, it's going to be for nobody. It's going to therefore just support the status quo. And that's where we are when people say we shouldn't support DEI, we shouldn't have affirmative action, and then we end up exactly where we are. And so I do believe we're in this sort of like dangerous phase right now in American history and American society because we have this retrenchment. People don't want you to read certain books so that you can't learn things, because then if you can't learn certain things, you're not going to see where we are and not want to do anything about it.
yeah, I mean, this is a lot of stuff to unpack. I think what I'm going to have to kind of say here is that, this is a lot for everyone to take in and to understand. And I think this might have been the reason why you knew from the very get-go, as when you sat down to write this book, it had to be simple. It had to be a way that everybody could kind of take it in and then ease their way into like this understanding of it. Because I was listening to just the passion in your voice right now, like how much this has to change, right? I think that in your book, you most likely were able to find a way that took it and put it into small pieces. But then I could only imagine your voice getting into that book and ramping the engines and being like, this is time to change, right? Like you had to ease your readers in and then just slap them with the information. I feel like that's probably what you did.
And I tell them it's going to be a bumpy ride for them.
Yeah.
The people can hop around, like I was saying before, but there's a progression, right? The book is divided into 7 parts. And before each part, I acknowledge, I'll say like, maybe you're feeling a little guilty right now. Maybe you're overwhelmed. It's okay to take a pause, but come back to the material. Or if you don't understand certain things, I give them some ideas as to what they could do. Maybe during that pause, they go volunteer somewhere. Maybe they have conversations. Maybe they take a class. They could do other types of things because I recognize that the material is difficult, but I don't hold back. So it is a continual, chapter by chapter explanation of how the choices and thinking that everyday white people have supports a racialized caste system, supports racial prejudice, supports racism, supports white supremacy, on these very simple things. Like I talked earlier about like education. I put in those nuggets. I put in the nuggets of history here and there while I'm saying like, don't do this. And this is why you shouldn't do it. And I don't show up in the book except for like in the introduction. The rest of it, I'm just giving advice and you can assume what I think because I'm telling you what the rule is. You know what I mean? And I'm telling you a rule that doesn't have any gray area, right? And so, but the goal is give people a pathway to see how they can engage in a different kind of way. And I also see this book as being like my patriotic contribution to American society. I have a very different view of patriotism. I don't think it's about whether or not you wave a flag. I think it's about whether or not you're supporting the policies and laws in place and the Constitution that's going to support a more inclusive American society. And so that's what I care about. And that is what I've focused on, because I also believe that our racial diversity is our competitive advantage as a country on the global marketplace. There are economic benefits of diversity, right? Higher return on investment, more profitability, lower employee turnover, which is expensive, greater retention, all of these financial indicators. And so if it's economically beneficial for companies, then we can extrapolate that that's also economically beneficial for the country. And we have more diversity than other places. So that is our national competitive advantage, except we engage in self-harm as a nation. And we're currently engaged in some of the most significant self-harm as a nation based on who we elected as president and this retrenchment on diversity, equity, inclusion, and the banning of books, right? And not wanting people to learn. Like, we should want people to be educated, because when you're educated, then your economy grows, right? Like I also studied a lot. I was an econ major in college. When I was at the Kennedy School, my policy focus was international trade and finance. Like I think about economic things all the time, and we are hurting ourselves. And so I want people to see, because if they can't see it, then they're not going to be able to do differently and do better.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the economic side of it, because again, our listeners today are, entrepreneurs, business people, like everybody who is, made it to an amazing place in their lives, but all of us have economics to think about in terms of, our businesses, right? So another factor, if everything you said today, Fatima, didn't resonate with them, I mean, you'd think that should, So I love that. Yeah.
And if you want, I mean, it's up to you. I mean, if you want, I'm more than happy to share like my favorite passage from the book.
I think we would love that. Yeah, I'm sure you have a copy right there behind you.
So yeah, I'm more than happy to read you my favorite passage.
Yeah, sure. So if you'd like to go ahead and read us the passage, then that'll give our readers a glimpse into what they can expect from your book when they read it themselves.
Yes. And so this is from my chapter where the rule is, it's not personal when people of color don't want to discuss race. And I explain why that's the case, and, talk about why it could be problematic. And then I conclude the chapter with an analogy. And so just remember that the you in my writing is a white person. And this is the illustration that goes with this chapter.
Okay.
So it's kind of like Sisyphus going up that hill in eternal hell.
Understood. Okay. It took me a minute to see it on my screen.
Oh, do you want me to show you again?
Yeah, maybe hold it up just for it so that when we see it on the... Okay, so he's holding it on his back, and it's a big weight to carry to discuss it.
Yes. Okay. All right, so here's the analogy. what it's like talking to you about race. Let's put this in perspective. Recall life living in the pandemic. Do you remember that haunting feeling you felt that never went away, that the virus was lurking at every corner? You couldn't escape it because there were reminders everywhere, on the news, online, in social media, and when you saw your neighbors or people on the street. You felt a sense of omnipresence as you walked around, always on high alert, looking at others, seeing if they wore masks, looked ill, or coughed. You noticed them and observed how they reacted to you. You were in constant fear of your death. Loved ones may die or did die, and you felt perpetual anxiety. Your mental health was impacted along with your physical health from the stress. You had trouble sleeping. You weren't even safe in your own home because the virus could come to your door. You didn't know if you could trust the government or if officials had your best interests at heart, unsure if they would do something to kill you. You felt powerless, as if there were nothing you could do to change things to make your life better since you weren't in control. You had to resign yourself to your circumstance, but you didn't want to accept your reality. You wanted to resist and somehow make things better. When you tried, you didn't succeed. That's what it's like living under racism every day, 24/7, 365. Racism is a pervasive, invisible force, just like COVID. There's no escape. It's constant, never a break or reprieve. It's isolating and marginalizing. It attacks your life, bank account, livelihood, housing, healthcare, schools, and dinner table, and separates your family. You want the government to do something about it, but politicians want you to laissez-faire your way to non-solutions, absolving themselves of responsibility, willfully blind to its impact. You suck it up. You deal with big picture systemic issues. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Heal yourself. Pave your destiny. Avoid your own death or murder. Welcome to living like a Black or brown person in America. But with racism, there's no vaccine coming. No magic pill to inoculate society. This is what it's been like since the 1500s. It isn't getting better. There are new strains, new waves, and invisible resurgences, mutating, reinventing itself, seemingly dormant, but always there stalking, ready to strike and viciously kill. This is the reality. It's bleak. So when you want to discuss racism, sometimes people of color only want to discuss it with those who understand what they've gone through, not white folks who'll trivialize things, which is akin to speaking to an anti-masker who berates innocent and defenseless store clerks. That's you questioning racism and their experiences. You're the anti-masker, anti-vaxxer in the conversation. When you come with covert microaggressions, overt aggression, a lack of knowledge, and a rejection of facts. Now, can you understand why no one wants to talk to you? They're already too busy trying to literally survive.
That is extremely powerful. And I think that, using COVID-19 as sort of an overarching metaphor, you're able to kind of resonate with everybody because we all went through that, no matter what your race was or where you were. Pretty much it was a global pandemic that everybody know what that was like. And you were able to really put us into those shoes. So that was incredible. Like, to all of our listeners right now, if that didn't touch your hearts, I don't know what will. You have to pick up that book and read more. You probably have more stories just like that really just get right down to the nitty-gritty of it.
It's just blunt, honestly,
Yeah.
through. And
you don't sugarcoat it necessarily.
I don't sugarcoat it. Because somebody who is going to want to approach a person of color to talk to them about race, the last thing most of them will think is that they are coming at them like the anti-vaxxer, coming for the store clerk, right? They're not necessarily thinking about it in that context. And so I'm just trying to meet people where they are and then push them towards evolving, to challenge their underlying assumptions, challenge how they see themselves in the world, how they see how they behaved in the past, and encourage them to make a change and showing them the pathway towards that change. And frankly, some people who read the book may not even understand, all of why I'm saying something. And I would rather have the person who doesn't fully understand it, but changes their behavior than the person who has the whole hearts and minds ideology and does absolutely nothing.
Understood. Yeah, all you have to do is read it and see what you can do to make your own changes personally. And if it's one person, that's great. If it's everybody, that's even better, right? So I get that. And I see why your message is just something that you've been able to spread through the release of this book. I'm wondering, ever since that book came out, and I'm sure all of our listeners are wondering, have you seen maybe like an influx of people reaching out to you, looking for more guidance and maybe sharing stories of how they've changed based on your teachings?
Yes, there have been people who've reached out and said things like they didn't realize some of the things that they were doing were harmful. And it got them to really evaluate how they had been behaving in the past. And people have also talked about how they see it as a helpful tool. For example, like, their kid that was going to be like going off to college and living in what will be one of the probably more diverse environments they've ever lived in, and how that could be helpful. Or, people starting at a company, thinking about how it's a useful tool. I mean, I wrote it so that people can turn to it as if it were like a dictionary or a thesaurus, like a traditional reference tool that they can go to for answers and guidance in real time. But yes, people have seen it, people have felt it as being very impactful. And I also got a lot of really positive reviews of the book. So I got a positive review in Publishers Weekly. I got a positive review in Kirkus. It's been endorsed by people like Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, Angela Davis, Congressman Jamal Bowman, Rabbi Sharon Brous, a whole host of people. And in fact, I was just, speaking recently and sharing the similar passage that I shared with you with Jesse Jackson Jr., who remarked that he felt that this writing really reminded him of James Baldwin, and how, he would just make these very poignant analogies and commentary about American society and race in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is just something that we're all hoping to accomplish in our own books. I mean, a lot of our listeners today, they have their own ideas for, content relating to their path to entrepreneurship or their business strategies, or maybe it's even like another genre like self-help or leadership. But I think these ideas definitely are extremely impactful and need to be heard as well. So while our listeners today are taking in all these tips, I think they're also taking in how you were able to make that message come across so strongly. I mean, if you're talking about it right now to me, and I'm hearing you speak about it, and so is passion, I can only imagine what picking up the book would do too. And I think that's something all of our listeners can learn from. I'm wondering, have you done like an audiobook with this or any other additional content to sort of supplement all of these teachings?
So there's the printed version of the book, there's the ebook, and there is an audiobook. I'm not the one that reads the audiobook.
I was going to say you should, because you definitely
I'm not.
would.
My publisher had,
Yeah.
they went ahead and, they had it done. But what I will say, if people decide to get the audiobook, right? Like I've heard, different feedback, like some, people have different versions of the book, but, and people love to hear something like on the go or when they're cooking or driving their car, or whatever it is that they're doing. But I think it's also important for people to supplement the audiobook with the printed version, because if they don't have the printed version, they're not going to get those translation charts the same way.
Right.
They're not going to get the illustrations. Yeah. They're just charts and other things that just can't be translated in audio form. So I encourage people to get both versions. And then if people go to my website, and they could just go to, fatimahgilliam.com and find this, but I do have discussion guide that people can download if they're wanting to ask themselves more questions, if they want to do a book club event, if they want to talk about it in their family. There's a comprehensive discussion guide they can download.
Great. And I'm glad that you have all those additional resources, because it's another way for us to interact with your materials and your teachings and further debunk these blinders that are covering our eyes sometimes. I think that's great. So I'm definitely going to be checking out your book, and, even the audiobook, everybody listen to it on your commute to work. Like, why not? Like, allow yourself to kind of get immersed in some of these tips and see what you can implement in your own lives tomorrow. I mean, let's give ourselves some homework. Tomorrow, go out, listen to a chapter. They could be listened to on their own, right? They don't have to be all in consecution. So whatever you have time for, whenever you're able to, it's all important stuff. And another side note for our listeners to hear, Fatimah really did organize her book from beginning to end in ways that are going to help readers not only engage in it, like notice that she, has all these images and, structure chapters so that they could be evergreen, she also has all these materials for us to interact with way after publication. You're keeping your book relevant. You're keeping it accessible and able for readers to reach out to, even though it's already been out for a while. It's still being relevant. You're breathing life into it. And that's something that we all need to make sure that we're doing in our books too. So you did that really well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So, two more questions for you. The first thing is, kind of what's on the horizon for you next? You have your book, you have the audiobook. Is there going to be a sequel? What can we be expecting for in the new year?
Well, I don't have plans to write another book in the short term. I mean, this is my first book and it came out January 30th or 31st, 2024, right? So, I'm still giving talks about this book. I do have ideas for other books. Some of those other books don't necessarily talk about race. I mean, I have an idea for writing a book on negotiation skills. But in the short term, with this material, part of what I am focused on is getting people and organizations to see its relevance beyond thinking about it in a sort of diversity race lane, as opposed to thinking about it that this is about connecting across difference. It's about negotiating. It's about managing through polarizing topics. It's about conflict resolution. It's about how to build a relationship with someone, right? And if people become more successful at not just saying, oh, the race thing, I'm just going to bank it over here in my head, as opposed to saying, like, this is about interpersonal skills. This is about how are you engaging as a citizen, as a community member, as a family member. So, and for companies, getting them to think about that as well, especially right now, because there's a lot of data that there's this rise in incivility going on. The Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, started an incivility index at the beginning of 2024. And they, through their research, said that, there are 190 million incidents or acts of incivility every single day, over 70 million taking place in the workplace that are costing the economy $2 billion a day, right? When in terms of people who may want to leave a job, they check out, they don't show up to work, because they're being offended. And at the core, the incivility index is showing like an uptick. And even, during the holidays, there was another study that came out that said something like 1 out of 5 Americans didn't even necessarily want to spend time with their family because of conflict around incivility, polarization, politics. So what I see with this book is it can help people deal with some of this incivility and how they can, if you're going to interact in a better way with other people, then you're going to have more of these sort of powder keg, dumpster fire, scenarios that unfold if people understand how they can better engage and better behave.
Understood. Yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing that huge last tip. I mean, honestly, I think we could spend like hours and hours going over everything in this book. I think we might even need to make another podcast so that we can really dive into depth about this. I mean, it's just another way to spread your word and your message. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. That's why you wrote your book. I guess the reason I asked what's next is because I think this could be applied in many other contexts. I love that you're focusing on sort of like the ROI for changing your mindset, right? Like, in a business context, it's helping your economics, it's helping your workplace culture, it's helping, on negotiations, like you said. I think maybe something to consider, in this coming year is that, maybe there could be a way for you to kind of take what you wrote and apply it to other areas too. I mean, parenting, right? Starting from the scratch, from the very beginning, other fields and industries. I don't know if you touched too much upon, like, I don't know, customer service or, even like the culinary industries. And I'm just wondering, like, there's so many different levels of this sort of thing. And if you ever thought about writing a book and kind of just catering it to other areas, it could also just increase the reach. Just a thought. I'm just trying to think of other ways you can spread it. Being interesting.
Well, that's true. There could be, sort of like race rules for teachers or race rules
Exactly.
for senior executives or race rules for medical doctors. There can be
we can make a mini series on all these types of things. I wasn't sure how in depth you got into that in the original race rules, but
well, that book is currently written in a very broad, generic way so that it can have broad applicability, whether
Yeah.
that is for someone in their personal life, their professional life, whether they're, a student or they're an employee or they're a business owner. It's very generic so that it can hit as many people as possible, but the core information is helpful across the
Yeah.
board. But what is really critical, especially in this current landscape, is for people to recognize that this kind of information is needed, right? And I say that because we have this broad scale attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if there's an attack on it, then that also means that fewer people and companies want to embrace these kinds of topics.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. I think it would be a good idea to really make like a mini series on those different topics because, maybe you want specific strategies, like you said, as a teacher, right? Like how can you be inclusive to all your students and their families as well, and your coworkers too? Or, teaching hard content in a way that maybe would make a difference so that we're not all thinking about the historical events that you've mentioned in the same way, but in a better context. So I don't know, it's something to think about. If you're ever interested in that, please reach out to me because I would love to help you work on that because I think it's something that, maybe running it by even just like an editor. I do a lot of angel writing too, maybe additional research help. It's something that I think is powerful. I think it needs to be done, in every context, not just general, but in every little niche.
I
Education.
mean, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
I would love for there to be little video vignettes, even like to even dial it down. Even, like I said, I wrote for the lazy reader, but even the person who's so lazy that they're not even going to read a book, what I
Yeah.
mean?
Why not make
Like a
it a YouTube
two-page chapter,
channel? Yeah, exactly. Well, that's another thing I always tell my listeners and my clients to do is when you're writing your book, plan for that alternative content, right? Like as you're writing chapter 1, think about what's my YouTube video for chapter 1 going to be, right? Like start planning it in advance and get ready to make that content schedule. And it's not only going to keep promoting your book, but keep the content relevant. So if you decide to move forward and make these series, it's something we could do together too, is kind of be like, okay, what's the tips that we can make for educators, for example, right? And then what's going to be in that little video that we can put alongside it, and QR codes. You could throw a QR code in there and be like, all right, you don't want to read this chapter, watch this video, just hear the information, right? I mean, just another interesting thing to think about.
I will definitely think about it. Thank you.
Yeah. But other than that, I guess, we've shared a lot of ideas during this podcast today. I'm curious to know, do you have any last words of advice that you might want to leave our listeners off with today?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is that people have to make the decision today. Who are they trying to be? How are they trying to contribute in a positive way to society? And if they see themselves as wanting to be a positive contributor, then what are they going to commit to doing today? I think an easy step is to, yes, go ahead and get my book. That is something that is a simple thing that they could do today. But then if they get the book, then actually use the book and tell other people about the book. And I'm not even trying to say that in the sense of like, I'm trying to get people to buy books. It's because it has advice in there that other people have not written about. Like, it's not a vanity project for me in writing this book. It's writing a book. It's not going to be my bread and butter. You're not going to make a ton of money off of an actual book, right? I make money off of consulting. But I decided to put this out there to be helpful. So the final message is, if not you, then who? If not now, then when? So if now is the time, then make a choice to do something today. And that thing today should move this country closer to being a more inclusive place where people don't feel marginalized by the poor choices that people make in their daily lives.
Thank you so much for sharing that. To all of our listeners, please take that home with you today. And, as we wrap up this conversation, even pause this podcast right now, stop right here, and then maybe even take out a Post-it note, right? And think about what are the 3 ways that you're going to start putting these implementation tonight, right? Like, don't delay, like she just said, like step 1, check out her book. Step 2, implement a tip that you learned from the podcast, right? Don't delay. Pause our recording right now and just do it. and then come back so we can wrap you up.
Well, I'll
um,
give 3 tips right
oh,
now.
let's do
So
it.
step one, yes, get my book. Step two, pay attention to what you see on the news and where you're getting your news from to question some of these underlying assumptions related to the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think that is really critical. So get the book, number one. Number two, understand what's going on with the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And number three, schedule a reminder on a weekly basis of what you are going to personally do to advance a more inclusive American society, whether that is watching a film, reading a book, going to a cultural event at a museum, volunteering somewhere, checking how you might have silenced somebody in a meeting, whatever it is, put in your calendar a weekly reminder. That's the only way that you can disrupt racism and make an ongoing life cycle of positive change.
Wow, and I love that you even gave the reminder. That's a way to make sure that we all don't forget and we're going to do it. I mean, I've already left myself little notes right here on my computer. I'm going to download your book and take a look myself. So to all of our listeners, do the same. Check it out right now. And honestly, thank you, Fatima. It's been a really great conversation today. I mean, I think that your approach to disrupting racism is just something that's fresh, right? It's blunt, it's right in your face, but also accessible. I think the three-step framework, it really provides your readers with practical tools to move beyond, being comfortable and making action happen, right? So everybody listening, check out Race Rules. It offers a clear path forward for those who are ready to do the work of becoming true racism disruptors, not just watchers. And also to our listeners, you can find Fatima's book on Amazon and on her website as well. I'm sure, look for more of her work in the Ozara group as well. And remember, as Fatima's taught us, there's no neutral zone in the fight against racism. Every day presents an opportunity to share what you know, to choose disruption over complacency. And it's all extremely powerful stuff. And if any of this inspired you today, you have your own beliefs and you want to get it out there, don't stop. Do what Fatima did. Write a book as well, right? You could always reach out to Officer on a Mission for help with that. You could also reach out to Fatima for additional guidance on how you can make a change as well. Take out the post-it like we just said. Do something about it. So, with all that being said, Fatima, it's been a true pleasure speaking with you today, and I think it's going to be a very valuable conversation for our listeners. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah, me too. And everybody out there, check it out. Until next time, have a great night. Keep inspiring, keep leading, keep writing. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.